Welcome to the first of our spring lectures for 2021. It's great to see so many of you logging on. We're up to 80 at the moment, so that's fantastic. And from all over, somebody in the west coast of America, somebody in the east coast, somebody as far afield as Cooper and Fife. So you know we are global without a doubt. It's great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Mike Arrowsmith. Mike is a member of the Pictish Art Society and also a member, and indeed the chairman of the Save Wemyss Ancient Caves Society, SWACS for short. So he is well placed to talk about the subject tonight and the Pictishness of Wemyss Caves and what the recent excavation and analysis and rediscoveries tell us about that. So Mike, over to you.
Thanks, John. When I was asked to give a talk on the caves, I was initially slightly hesitant because many of you will already know a lot about them, and a lot of you will also have seen the presentation on the 2019 excavations, which was given by Joanna Handley of the Scate Trust at the TAFAC conference last year. So what I'm hoping to do in this talk is expand a little bit on that. I'll give a very brief introduction to the caves for those who don't know about them, and then give a summary of our 2019 excavations for those who haven't seen previous presentations, and talk about what we learned from them, in particular the very interesting new dating evidence that we gained. But as well as those excavations, I've been doing a little bit of lockdown research into some of the earlier investigations of the site, and taking the opportunity to re-examine and test some of their observations against modern new digital techniques. And finally, I've been working on a synthesis of what we now know about the caves and what we know about wider Pictish activity in Fife, and seeing how all that fits together. So there's quite a lot to get through. I'd better crack on. Firstly, just to introduce the caves, this is where they are. It's a coastal area of Fife, about 30 miles north of Edinburgh, and roughly the same distance southwest of St Andrews. There are 6 caves that are still accessible, which are marked in pink on this map, together with the medieval Macduff Castle here. The earliest dated archaeology that we have from the site is early Iron Age, radiocarbon dated between 440 and 700 BCE. And that comes from the soil above a set of ard marks. But there's also evidence of earlier use, which comes from the now destroyed Michael Cave, which is to the west of the village, and the caves that remain. And we're indebted to the local antiquarian George Dees, who undertook some early rescue archaeology in 1929, when he was notified that work on a new boiler room for the colliery above the cave had exposed these rock carvings. So on the left is a classic cup and ring mark, so probably Bronze Age or even possibly Neolithic in date. And next to it is a large panel of carvings, which, according to the notice in the Proceedings of the Society of the Antiquaries of Scotland in number 37, was interpreted by 2 separate academics at the time as a carving of an elk, amongst other uninterpretable figures. Now, this is the only record of that hunting scene, if you want to call it that we have, because by the time Dees could visit the site, he only had a few hours left before the cave was filled in with concrete. But he did manage to make a plaster mould of the cup and ring mark, which still exists in Coddy galleries, which we've had access to and had a look at. And it's unquestionably an authentic Bronze Age cup and ring mark. So that's really the earliest evidence we have for activity. Possibly in the side passage in Court Cave, there's possible other Bronze Age cup marks. They're possibly miniature cup marks. They're a couple of 100 yards from where the large cup and ring mark was located. And although they appear to take the form of a cross, we know that there was a much more extensive panel below here, which has since broken off. They are smaller than most cup marks, but midget cup marks like these are certainly not unprecedented. And these are absolutely not natural, so also possibly at least Bronze Age in date. Opposite these, we have this figure, known locally as Thor and His Goat. And this in style, we think, is probably closer to earlier Iron Age art. In particular, there's close comparisons with a Romano-British figure, which is carved on living rock in Northumberland. Now, we'll come back to Thor later, because there may be something else significant about this carving that we've been pondering on. So, although the caves are famous, of course, for their Pictish carvings, this is really to show that there's good evidence of people were carving on the living rock here long before that period. It's a very long tradition. So here are the Pictish carvings. There were 49 symbols altogether recorded. These are illustrations by Andrew Gibb, and they include the iconic Pictish symbols, double discs, Pictish beasts, crescents and V rods, floriated rods, as well as a fish and possibly one of only two Pictish carved boats. There are other carvings not clearly identifiable as Pictish, but they're in the same areas, and they may well actually be contemporary with these Pictish carvings. Of those 49, tragically, we only have 26 left due to cave collapse and other damage. But here are some of them as they still exist today in recent photographs. So there's still a lot of Pictish art to look at on the site. So that's really a very quick overview of the site, quick tour of the site. What I'm going to do now is look at some of the previous archaeological investigations that have taken place. So there are numerous small-scale interventions that we know about from the 1980s. And I stress that we know about, because we also know that other people have been nosing around in there. There have been unauthorized digs, various things turned up at various times. But you can see on here, these are the caves in red, and the trenches that we know have been dug previously are marked in blue, the blue and green rectangles and dots. Well before this, there was lots of antiquarian diggings and other activities that will have disturbed deposits on in the caves, and we really don't know much about those. There are some heartbreaking accounts of these diggings, where I instructed my workmen to clean out the deposits in the bottom of the cave, and then they all got thrown away because they were looking for far more interesting things and paleobotanical evidence and things that could actually tell us an enormous amount these days. So we know that an enormous amount has been lost, but we do know some things. This is a summary of the simplified profiles of the archaeology outside the caves. So essentially, they're sitting on a raised beach. They have cultivated soils, and this is where the Iron Age plough marks come from. Outside Jonathan's cave there, 400 outside Well Cave, 770 to 400 BC, and 400 to 170 BC outside Jonathan's cave. Above that, we have a medieval midden and finds from that. And there are also two skeletons came from the site, one of which plausibly dates 890 to 1220 AD, might bring it right in at the end of the Pictish period. And we think that these may well actually be just the last two survivals of what was a far more extensive gravesite that has long been eroded out by the sea. And we may just be looking at the last two remnants of that. So we know that in the Iron Age, people were farming here and presumably living very close by. We certainly know people were living there in the medieval period. We find in the Middens, we find their food remains and pottery, and we know that they were burying their dead here. So that's outside the caves. Inside the caves, there were, in 2004, there were excavations undertaken here by Time Team, and that's what these are drawn from. And these, inside Jonathan's cave and Well Cave, Jonathan's cave in particular, were very, very shallow deposits, and just about everything in there was modern in date. In Well Cave, there was medieval pottery found inside some of the trample. The most promising cave that Time Team came up with was Sliding Cave. Now, this is a cave which is actually some way up from the coast level. It's quite inaccessible. Not a lot of people know it's there, and we want to really try and keep it that way, because this is the cave that really has the undisturbed archaeology in it and is the most promising. And what was really interesting about the Time Team excavations was that they had datable archaeological deposits of the 3rd to 4th century in date, and they were underneath sealed layers of collapse. So there's nothing later than those dates of 244 to 388 AD. However, within those caves, there are also Pictish symbols. So At the time, this was regarded as possibly a bit of an anomaly, that of course everybody knows that Pictish symbols are later than that, and so the floor level that was discovered couldn't really be related to these symbols in any way. However, since 2004, there's been a lot of new information about the archaeological context of Pictish symbol stones, particularly from the work of Gordon Noble, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with at the University of Aberdeen, and also the work at Sculptor's Cave, which is the only other cave in Scotland which has a collection of Pictish carvings in it, a work there undertaken by Ian Arnott of the University of Bradford. And we've also done a lot of work at Wemyss in furthering our activity in promoting and gaining more understanding of our caves. So this was a really good time to revisit the archaeology of the caves. And we had a number of questions here that we really wanted to answer. Characterize, firstly, any deposits inside Cork Cave and Dew Cave, because we knew absolutely nothing about them, those two caves, what was going on in there. One of the reasons we wanted to do this in Cork Cave is because we want to put an accessible path in from the Fife coastal path runs outside the caves, but it's quite difficult for people with mobility issues to get inside and have a look. So one of our sort of long-term management objectives is to put an accessible path in there, and obviously we need scheduled monument consent to do that. And so we wanted to have a good look at whether there was anything under the ground, so that we didn't inadvertently damage anything, and to gain scheduled monument consent. And Sliding Cave, that has the best archaeological deposits, is actually also the most vulnerable to coastal erosion because of its position on the halfway up the cliff. So it's important for us to learn as quickly as possible, as much as we can about it. And critically, could we confirm and improve the dating that Time Team got to see whether we can get any consistency with their 3rd century dating for the activity in there. The excavations that took place were a partnership, I should quickly say here. It was ourselves in Swax with community volunteers, the Scape Trust based at the University of St Andrews, and the University of Aberdeen's Leave Hume funded Comparative Kingship project under Gordon Noble came down and did the excavations in Sliding Cave. So let's quickly look at a quick bit of orientation. These are the 3 caves that we excavated in. Of course, we needed scheduled monument consent, and we needed permission from the landowners, the Wemyss estate, to dig to dig the pits in here. They were very limited pits because really it was about, they were targeted for the reasons that I've just said. As well as doing these excavations, we also investigated this promontory area here. Hopefully you can see me moving my mouse, the promontory just in front of Macduff Castle, and we carried out geophysics in the cemetery behind the castle as well. Now the results of those were really inconclusive, and I'm not going to talk about them. If you want to see the results of those, there's a link to the full report of these excavations at the end where you can have a closer look. So what I'm going to do is jump in and give the results of what we find and a bit of discussion, and I'll do that cave by cave, starting with this one here, Cork Cave. This is Cork Cave, and you can see in front of the cave this whole section of collapse here. The mouth of this cave was much larger. The first antiquarians who visited the caves talked about them as cathedrals of light with great big wide open entrances. Unfortunately, the damage that they've suffered over the years for all sorts of reasons, cave collapse, mining on the site, means that we've had a lot of this sort of thing at the caves with this degree of cave collapse. So this is the scheduled area here is in red, and the test pits that we actually excavated are marked in green. We'd like to have had time to do the blue ones as well, but we didn't have time. So we put one pit outside the cave and 2 pits inside Cork Cave. These are some of the people who excavated it. Now I can actually see at least one of them looking at me right now in the meeting. So hopefully I'm going to do justice to what they found. I'll start at test pit 3 here. This is Michael using a mattock to get through what is a highly compacted cave floor. And you can see that he's doing this just underneath this extensive panel of Pictish carvings. I don't know how well you can pick out some of these images, but you can see on their double discs, you can see a floriated rod and a whole number of a swan and a whole number of other Pictish symbols on that surface. So we wanted to have a look, see whether there's any archaeology remaining underneath there. And this is a section through the deposits, and we suspected they would be shallow, but probably not really even as shallow as they turned out to be. Just about everything in there was a very thin layer of trample, and most of what had been trampled in was actually coal dust as a remains from the mining activity in there. We've had a whole load of modern finds, glass, matches, loads of matches, bootlaces, clay pipes, etc. So absolutely nothing really came out of there. Trench 2 inside the main entrance was equally as compact, and you can see a really good example of the layers that we found there. Now you can see the particularly dark layers, which are comprised of coal dust. It's very tempting to link those with the known use of Court Cave as an unofficial miners' social club. They would stop in here on their way to and from their shift at the local collieries, do a lot of gambling. We've got photographs of them taking part in this, and we know people who actually acted as lookouts when they were kids to make sure that local village Bobby didn't find them doing it. In fact, this is a photograph of them playing a game called Toss at the entrance to Court Cave around 1935. So these are the guys that brought all that coal dust in. We did find a little bit of medieval pottery, but very, very little. And what that tells us is that Court Cave was kept extremely clean, and that really there was probably right up until the 19th century. And it looks like it had a very smooth bedrock floor. And it was used for all sorts of activities in the past, including workshops, stabling for animals, communal gatherings. We also know that the fishermen used to dry their nets in there. It's called Bark Cave because they used to dip it in preservative made from bark and dry their nets in there. So it's had a whole range of uses, and it was quite clearly kept very, very clean and dug out. So really we established there's nothing really of interest left in Court Cave, which is disappointing from an archaeological point of view, but means we can actually go ahead and put our perth in there and make the cave more accessible to visitors. And this is the pottery that came, the very small amount of pottery, which had been swept into a crevice, really, but shows that it was being used in the 13th, 14th century. Let's go outside, and we dug this very, very big hole. A couple of volunteers, Chris and Jamie, enormous amount of work in here. In fact, we had to stop by the time it got 2.5 meters deep because we were worrying that they were actually going to, they're not very tall, and when it was well over their head height, and we had to make sure on health and safety grounds we just couldn't go any further down. But their efforts really paid off in this trench, because there they are, just before we closed it down. So unlike the material inside the Court Cave, this was a midden, and it was extremely deep and packed full of archaeological material. So it was mostly food remains. There were a lot of animal bone and shellfish, but there's also pottery, and very significantly, there was debris from ironworking. And this is the first evidence that we have of ironworking on the site. So not only were they using Court Cave for communal activities, feasting and so on, they were actually doing ironworking here. So this midden was very mixed up, in fact. You can look at these, if you look at the earliest dates that we've got down the bottom, 561 to 651 AD, which came back from the radiocarbon dating, so quite clearly in the middle of the Pictish period. And above that, although there's still a certain amount of mixing going on, remains from from much later. So it's very mixed up. There's no more modern intrusions. A lot of bones in there, and this is what we found. So it's a real mix of domesticates, sheep, goat, pigs, but also wild animals, and some of which were really important for their pelts. So seals and otters, for example, we found remains in there. And interestingly as well, the pottery that we found inside was also not Scottish. It's similar with the inside of Cork Cave. This was also English imports. This is the ironworking residue that we found. And what these are, this is Gemma Cruikshank, who analysed it for us. She couldn't be clear on where exactly they're from, but she said that one fragment is probably blue. And this is the mass of iron which comes out of the furnace as a product of smelting. So they're actually smelting iron here, probably. And the bloom is then hammered to bash off the impurities. And this is the process that we think was happening outside the caves. Now, amongst the pieces, we found this cylinder of fired clay, which is vitrified at one end, and this is the remains of a tuyere. And a tuyere, for those that don't know, is the end of the bellows which forces air into a furnace. So excellent evidence of, again, excellent evidence of ironworking going on. Now, the problem with tuyères is that they look pretty much the same for a long, long time. So you can't really use it to give a diagnostic date. And because it was found in this mixed layer, we're really desperate to get a date out of this to establish that whether this is a later medieval activity or could this even be evidence of Pictish metalworking going on here. We didn't find any metalworking inside Cork Cave, but that doesn't mean it wasn't taking place there. In fact, the midden material in this trench is probably from inside the cave and has been swept out into this midden area. So, and traditionally we know that caves and rock shelters are well suited for metalworking. So Smelter's Cave, for example, which is part of the Rosemarkie Cave complex on the Black Isle, there's a lot of evidence there associated with metalworking. And there's an ironworking horizon there, which has been radiocarbon dated from 600 to 800 AD. So we're extremely interested to find out whether our metalworking evidence fits in with that. And we're going to attempt to date the tuyere using scientific thermoluminescence and other techniques, which we'll discover the last time it was heated above a certain temperature. The problem with that technique is that it's destructive. So in order to do the analysis, it's a very hard decision to take. It means that we have to lose the tuyere. This dating hasn't happened yet. Unfortunately, COVID knocked that on the head, and there's a large backlog of things to be dated. So we can't actually give you any dates of that, but we're hopeful of getting those soon. Sorry, this is just a quick illustration of how this sort of process would take place, and that's the tuyere ringed in red there. So that's where this piece comes from. And this is it itself. It's probably the most documented piece of tuyere ever, because having to destroy it, we've made sure we've got this 3D model of it so that we can study it in as much detail as we possibly can. Right, moving on to Dew Cave. This is Dew Cave. Inside there are a whole series of rock cut nesting boxes, and there was originally a wall in front of the cave. You can see here in this picture from the turn of the 19th, 20th century, where you can see the holes at the top of the wall to allow the pigeons to fly out. And dew cuts are not uncommon. That in Scotland, of course, that there are literally thousands littering the landscape, but they're actually very rare in caves contexts. And what's particularly rare about the one that we have at Wemyss is that other dew cuts in cave contexts have actually had the nesting boxes built up through stone structures. These ones being carved into the living rock itself are really, we don't know of any others where this has happened. Perhaps somebody does know of any others. So it's a very, very interesting cave, and we wanted to know a lot more about it because we knew absolutely nothing. So this is our investigation team, Tom, Kirsty and Hannah, who shifted an enormous amount of soil in here. One of the problems with these excavations are to get the condition of scheduled monument consent is that you have to put back everything you take out and leave it as it was. So we shifted tons, or rather I didn't, they did, shifted tons of earth literally out of this cave, and then of course had to put it all back at the end. So what did they find? We concentrated, in fact the only one that we dug was this big trench at the back of the cave in this area here. And what they were generally excavating was material that had washed into the cave following the collapse of the western chamber to this cave in 1914. And that's a chamber which had many Pictish carvings, probably the best collection of Pictish carvings on site. But tragically, somebody had the bright idea of putting a coastal gun battery on top of it for the First World War, and when it was fired, it brought down the entire cave roof. So we've lost all those. One day when somebody leaves us millions of pounds, we hope to get back in there and actually see, because we know exactly where they are. We have a model, we have a good mapping of where they were recorded at the time. So hopefully they will actually be well preserved, those Pictish carvings, but for now they're completely out of our reach. So they dug a big hole in here, and unfortunately all the deposits in there turned out to be recent, but the excavation did throw up a whole load of new questions. In particular, you can see in this slide we uncovered a new layer of niches which go right down to the floor level. We also found niches cut into the cave floor. Now these can't possibly be nesting boxes. You don't cut nesting boxes into the floor level, and in fact a lot of people that have looked at this cave have suggested you don't really cut nesting boxes as low as they are in the walls of this cave either, because it makes the birds vulnerable to rats, etc. And so it's quite strange in the way in which this has been done anyway. So what are these? They're not mentioned in any antiquarian accounts, which include a full survey of the Dew Cave in 1890. If anybody's got any ideas, one suggestion is they might be supports for a wooden structure, but what that was doing in there we don't know. Was it part of the superstructure of the caves, or did it form a completely different purpose? And I'll just throw in very quickly that it has been suggested that these nesting boxes are actually repurposed, and they had a different function before they were used as a medieval dupcot, and are the niches related to that earlier function? We just can't say. And so here they are again, and it shows them in relation to the niches along the back of the cave. And there's also a rock cut basin you can see in the forefront here as well, again, which we have no idea the purpose of that, and we didn't get to the other side of it. And hopefully once we can get back in there and do excavations, we'll excavate further out and see just exactly what the extent of that rock cut basin is. But a second conundrum was that the primary deposit filling the floor here was mostly beach sand. And we also found a piece of corrugated, very 20th century corrugated iron, very close to the bedrock. So the sea must have come into the cave at some point and washed away all existing deposits. And we think this happened sometime between when this photograph was taken in 1900 and the 1950s, when this photograph was taken. And in our guidebook, Frank Rankin, who's one of the founders of SWAX, talks about a storm in 1945 which washed away the seawall and the bank in front of the cave, which broke down the wall, which sealed the entrance of the cave, so that the cave is now open to the shore. So ever since then, the sea has been coming in, and at the high spring tides, this still happens, the sea comes in there. So we think that explains what the nature of the deposits in there. I'll now get on to Sliding Cave, the final cave that we excavated. This is Sliding Cave, also known as Sloping Cave, and you have to scramble to get down into this one. This is the cave and the two trenches that we excavated here in green. These are the picture symbols in there, and the main aim here was to see whether we put the trenches below, one trench was below these carvings, to see if the deposits that had been discovered by Time Team, which were in a trench further along, actually extended further into the cave. So this is the Time Team results. The excavations, just to remind you, they gave a date of 244 to 388 AD. and this is the trench below those Pictish carvings. It's mostly natural inwash. There's layers of trample which contain burnt material, bone and shell. And as I say, the main objective was to sample these. Here it is again, to sample these for more dating. So let's have a look at the results of those. And you can immediately see that we did get dates out of it. And you can also see that our dates very closely match what time team came up with. Now this is really interesting. If you plot the dates here in order using radiocarbon dating, the yellow ones are all from the same stratigraphic layer, and then look at the horizons for those dates. Nearly all our dates fall within 50 to 600 AD. If you take out the outlier, the one on the extreme right, then it puts the horizon within 50 to 500 AD. Sorry, all the dates within 50 to 600 AD. With the outlier, it's 50 to 500 AD. If you take away that outlier, then it's between 50 to 400 AD. So absolutely in line with what time team found with their investigation. So that's very interesting. We have very early dates and we have Pictish carvings in this cave. And that suggests that these carvings have actually been made at quite an early date, earlier than as likely been thought. So to put these into context, we're zooming up the coast north to Dunacair, 20 miles or so south of Aberdeen, where this sea stack was excavated by Gordon Noble a few years ago now. And it's a promontory fort, which is famous for plaques of Pictish carvings which were discovered in the early 19th century. And they were assumed to once have been part of the rampart wall here. And you can look at Gordon's talk, and there's lots of published information about this site. So I'm not really going to go into that here. What's of interest to us is at Wemyss is the remarkable similarity between the carvings at Dunacair and the carvings at Wemyss. So they're shown here, the Dunacair carvings on the left and the Wemyss carvings on the right. So if you look at the fish, if you look at the whatever you want to call this, the tulip type figure, you look at the double disc and floriated rod, the similarity is really quite remarkable. And what's also very instructive to compare is Gordon's dates from Dunacair. Also, these dates taken from the rampart of 285 to 350 AD. So again, this chart, not only stylistically, but also in terms of radiocarbon dating, this really chimes with what we're getting at Wemyss. So I'll throw one more site into the mix. This is Sculptor's Cave. It's the only other cave containing Pictish carvings that's been scientifically dated. And again, if we look at the comparison between the carvings, they show remarkable similarities again. You can see that the striking similarity of form between the carvings of Sculptor's Cave and the carvings at Wemyss. Now, Sculptor's Cave has a very grisly archaeological story. It appeared originally to have been used as a mortuary cave in the Bronze Age. There were thousands of human bones and offering, and amongst them were human vertebrae with sword cuts through them, and at least 6 victims, 4 adults and 2 teenagers, had been decapitated in the cave. Now, it was initially thought that those decapitations were contemporary with the rest of the Bronze Age deposits, but recent work by Ian Armitt and his team from Bradford University, this is inside Sculptor's Cave, has shown that the decapitations weren't actually Bronze Age. And again, these were radiocarbon dated to between 220 and 335 AD. So within very slap bang in the middle of the period that we've been talking about at Wemyss and Dunacair. Now, and Ian Armitt speculates that these decapitations could have been a single event, and they may have represented a single event of executions in the place of ritual significance. Now, Ian doesn't actually, in his very lavishly produced book on the excavations, doesn't actually necessarily agree that he thinks that the carvings themselves don't date before the 6th century AD. I must admit, I struggle to see his conclusions from that, and far be it from me to challenge somebody of Ian's reputation and standing. I think the evidence really, if you compare it with what we have at Dunnicare and what we have at Wemyss, there is no reason at all to think that those carvings aren't contemporary with those remains from the mid 3rd, 4th century as well. So this is the dating evidence from Sculptor's Cave. So that's really putting what our dating evidence in context with elsewhere. And I think we constructed quite a good argument that actually the carvings at Wemyss are relatively earlier than has been thought, alongside those at Dunnicare, and represent an early development of the Pictish symbol system. And sorry, this is a comparison just to demonstrate the exact similarity between the dating evidence. So just to show that the research process is always building on what's happened before, this map here actually makes this comparison between East Wemyss, Dunnicare, and Cowsey Cave, Sculptor's Cave, this was published, of all things, in the Pictish Art Society Journal of 1996, drawing attention to these 3 sites, and it written by Leslie Alcock, who concluded the difference between the symbols in caves and on Dunnicare, and he refers to plaque on Sanday on the one hand, and those on slabs and boulders in the open air on the other, have been treated here as evidence that a varied range of pictographs might be ancestral to the canonical class 1 symbols. So really, I think what we've done is given scientific evidence to that sort of idea that was being developed as long ago as 1996 by Leslie Alcock. Because if you remember, our carvings at Wemyss, they include the classic Pictish symbols, but they also include a whole number of other symbols that don't appear elsewhere, but could be broadly contemporary with the ones that we do have. So that's our excavations. Yeah, I've got a link to download the report at the end. But now I want to have a look at, if you like, that's the physical excavation. I want to look at move to having a look at some of the re-excavation of the archives, if you like, and look at some of the work of the previous antiquarian visitors to Wemyss. And in particular, I want to look at this section of Jonathan's Cave. It's an extremely badly damaged section. And possibly because it doesn't contain any symbols and it's very unclear what's going on here, it's attracted very little attention. We've tended, when we give tours, to describe the bit on the right as possibly the front of an animal, maybe grazing, and the section on the left as possibly a human figure, but never really given much thought to what that really means. And so in part prompted actually by a meeting that our own John Borland did for us about representation of warriors in Pictish art, we decided to have a much closer look at this panel and see what's there. So these are the earliest representations of what was there in the mid-19th century, and they were already described by James Young Simpson when he visited in 1866 as much faded and damaged. Now, the figure is discussed and mentioned by and other antiquarians and archaeologists over the next 40 years, but frustratingly, none of them can really agree on what they're actually seeing, let alone agree on an interpretation of what's there. So you can read, they all see different things. Christian McLagan sees a man and a woman and a child. The figures get known locally as the Adam and Eve figures, but there is no real agreement about what they are. Now, by the time human figures in early Pictish art, as we know, are extremely rare, and by the time the Wemyss figures were discovered, Riney 3 at the top here was the only definitely known human figure, as far as I can work out. It's not known exactly when the Westerton figure was discovered. We just know mid-19th century, but none of our antiquarians make any reference to these figures, so it's quite possible they didn't even really know about them. And there is no subsequent discussion since John Patrick in the very early part of the 20th century. Nobody else really discusses these figures again. in the context of human figures in Pictish art. No mention's made of it. So really what we're asking ourselves is, are we actually looking at something at Wemyss that fits in with these similar figures elsewhere? So I'm quickly, hopefully this will work. Are you all seeing this nice copper-coloured picture? This is a high resolution. Actually, I'll show you something else first. I'll bring my PowerPoint back up. Just bear with me. I knew it was a mistake to switch between screens. Yeah, so since the discovery of those two figures in the 19th century, we've got these two further figures, including, of course, I'm sure you'll all be aware of the Tulloch figure discovered a few years ago. So this is the set of Pictish warrior figures that we have, and we wanted to really look more closely at our figure to see whether it possibly fitted in with these ones. So this is the panel of what we have. This was taken, I did this a few weeks ago using high resolution photogrammetry and played around with the textures and so on to really have a much closer look at what we've got here. And there's a few things here that although everybody seems to have found different things, nobody's really noticed some of the things that we've discovered. So for example, depends what angle you're looking at, but quite clearly there's an arm coming out of the front of this figure here. There's also possibly, tantalizingly, a vertical shaft running up from the foot up to the top here. The problem with this this panel is that it's all, I'll just change the angle there so you can see again what we're looking at. So again, this would be the spear, if you like. The problem with this wall is it's so badly damaged and so badly degraded that it's really open to interpretation, and it's quite possible to imagine all sorts of things going on here that aren't actually there. Every angle that you look at, you see something else, and then it disappears. So really one of the reasons for showing this to you all here is that a lot of you have spent a lot of time studying Pictish figures and can probably have your own very good ideas about what we're actually looking at here. So it's really hoping for a sort of crowdsourced opinion, if you like, on what we're actually looking at. And so I'll put the link in the chat to the model there that's on Sketchfab so that you can all go and have a look at it for yourself. I've done a quick comparison with all the figures together. So these are all the ones that we now know about, and with our Wemyss Caves figure on the right hand side. Now the immediate thing that you notice there is that he's facing the wrong way, if you like. All the others are moving to the left, he's moving to the right. But then we get that at Wemyss. A lot of our symbols and a lot of our carvings aren't quite right in some way in comparison with the more formalized and structured carvings on monumental stones. We have double discs and floriated rods are also in strange orientations. But one of the things to me that's striking to me about this is in particular is the head as well. If you look at the way the head here is carved and the similarity between that on two of the other stones, where it remains on other stones, you can really see, I think, that there's a very, very similar sort of hair going on there. And the general shape of the body, the form of the legs, I think there's a lot of similarities in there that suggest to me that at the very least we should be seriously considering this as perhaps a previously unrecognized part of that collection of carvings elsewhere, perhaps even ancestral to them if we're right about the date of the Wemyss the caves. And just as a footnote to that, I want to go back to the figure of Thor that we saw at the beginning, because you note that on all these carvings the warrior's spear has a very pronounced knob at the end of it. And if we go back and look at Thor, have a look at the shape of what he's carrying. Now this again is a very damaged carving, but particularly on John Romilly Allen's rubbing from 1890 on the right hand side, if what he's carrying is a spear, then at the bottom of it there is a pronounced bulb, just as there is with the warrior figure carvings. So I'll say no more than that. But are we perhaps also looking at something here that has an earlier relationship with those warrior figures? Right. So that's what we've been doing at Wemyss. Finally, and I'm going to have to rush through this a bit because I see I've already been on for 45 minutes or so. I'm going to look at how this might fit into Fife as a whole and what we know about Pictish culture and settlement in Fife. And a lot of what I've done so far, the slides on the caves, most of those came from Joanne Hambley. I've discussed the Pictish figure with other people. What follows is really opening myself up to evisceration from people who know much more about this sort of stuff than I do. But really, one of the things I've been doing in lockdown is having a look at the pattern of Pictish archaeology and what we know about what it might say about Fife and how Wemyss might fit into that. So I'm going to start with the Romans. It's long been suggested that the development of a distinctive Pictish culture was somehow a response to Roman intervention. Now that doesn't mean crudely that the people here were incapable of developing their old culture and somehow had to import the whole idea of carving from the Romans. I mean, as we've seen, there were people carving at Wemyss long before the Romans ever turned up. And it's also long been thought that the carving is just one stage in Pictish art, and that perhaps these symbols and figures have other perishable forms that are now lost to us before they started getting carved in stone. But the thing to notice about Fife, this is a map of the first Roman interventions into Scotland. So in the late 70s AD, the first push by the Romans into the north, and the Gasgridge forts that they build, and the Glen blocker forts at the base of the glens. And you can see that Fife is completely bypassed. There are 3, possibly 4, probably 3, I think, Roman forts within Fife, but they date to a much later date. And so, as with East Lothian on the other side of the Forth, what seems to have happened is that the Romans have completely bypassed it. Now, whether that's because the local Veniconis people were unable to resist, unwilling to resist, and quite fancied a bit of integration into the Roman world, I'm not going to speculate on that. But one thing we do know is that a large amount of Roman silver arrived after the arrival of the Romans into the area. So this is the Daresey hoard, discovered a few years ago at Daresey in the middle of Fife. And we know from work at the National Museum of Scotland that this is Roman silver, and it's been carefully hacked into Roman weights and measures before arriving in Fife. So it's not plunder. It's been brought in and by the Romans themselves. And this is the very famous Norris Law hoard. Again, this is Roman silver, but this also incorporates Pictish metalwork. So you can see the Pictish symbols on here, which is possibly thought to be a leaf of a cavalry helmet. That's one interpretation of this. These pins and so on. Again, Roman silver, which a lot of which has been hacked up into Roman weights and measures, but also been reworked into Pictish art. Now, what this silver was for, we can't really say. It might have been a simple payoff to keep the peace. It might have been a payment for goods, for grain, mercenaries, slaves. It may possibly have been a combination of all of those things. And again, people have written quite a lot about this, particularly the National Museums of Scotland work, the Glenmorangie project, and so on. This is the locations of those silver hoards. So that's Daresey at the top, and Norris Law at the bottom. And the silver itself seems to arrive mainly in the late 3rd century, so after the abandonment of the Antonine Wall and the withdrawal essentially by Rome further south, following what was described by contemporaries as a genocidal war against the Métis, who were thought to border the west of Fife, the Caledonians, generally thought of as north of the Tay, but possibly also a term applied to the inhabitants of Fife itself. So it seems that they're paying off, for whatever reason, paying off with silver. And that campaign is when the early 3rd century campaign is when our Roman military remains date from. So these are the marching camps along the River Eden. There is another purported marching camp at Bonnybank down here, but most recent examination of that, I think, has dismissed that as or was very skeptical of that as a marching camp. So it seems to show that the Romans marched up the Eden. There may well have been another camp here at Guard Bridge, which has never been found. So they march up the Eden to the legionary fortress at Carpal. Now the Picts, of course, are first mentioned about 70 years after this intervention by the Romans, in the late 3rd century. So let's have a look at what we can say in Fife about the earliest archaeological evidence of a distinctive identity. And these are the Class 1 symbol stones. And here they are in purple. These are the only Class 1 symbol stones in Fife. I've done an extensive search of Canmore and every other resource that I can find, and these are the only Class 1 symbol stones that exist in Fife, and I think their distribution is very interesting. Now there's a lot of caveats to be made here. Obviously what remains, what we know, isn't necessarily what was once there for all sorts of reasons: land clearance, Reformation iconoclasm. There's all sorts of reasons why we can't necessarily conclude that what we know is an accurate representation of what was there. So everything I'm going to say has got to be treated with a lot of caution. But that said, these stones don't appear anywhere else in Fife apart from this cluster around the Eden Valley. So I wonder if that is actually telling us something. This is the richest agricultural land in Fife, and in an era when wealth was literally measured in cattle, I wonder whether this is one of the focal points of the flowering of early Pictish identity and of those societies that could commission and position these sites in the landscape. The other Class 1 symbols that you get in Fife are, of course, like Wemyss, they are in caves. So here they are, purple circles dotted along the coast of Fife. So we seem to have two sort of focuses: the southern coastal focus and the Eden Valley focus. I'm now going to look at settlement. As everywhere else, there is very little evidence for everyday settlement in Pictish times. Very little work has been done in it. All I'm aware of in Fife is these two green dots in the top here. This is Easter Kinnear and one other site, which show settlement and barrow sites. The pink dots are what are either securely dated or stylistically dated burial sites that probably date to the Pictish period. Most notably, I think London Links, Hallow Hill, and the big blue squares are the securely dated hill forts that we know we've got secure dating evidence from that put them in the Pictish period. Now, I think this is very definitely a partial picture. There are a host of undated hill forts in Fife that certainly merit further investigation. Norman's Law is the outstanding one that I think is crying out for somebody to go and put some holes in it and do some work on. And I know that because it exhibits all the signs of an early medieval form, and I know that Aberdeen University are certainly very keen to go and look at that, and hopefully they'll manage to get work started on there very soon. This is East Lomond Fort from work done by the sadly late Ollie O'Grady over the last few years, demonstrating that this was a Pictish power centre with metalworking, an annex which is actually much larger than even shown in this reconstruction here. And the other site is at Craig Rock, and I'm indebted to David Lowe for this fantastic picture taken during the recent snowstorm from Largo Law, showing the site. This is a site that wasn't even recognised as anything at all until 2010, until somebody spotted it by aerial photography. But just looking at that picture, how did nobody see this before? And Aberdeen came down, and we were fortunate in Swax to assist with the excavations here, and again have got dating evidence putting this firmly in the Pictish period. A relatively small fort, but it just everything about it, it's a classic early medieval fort with an annex. Now, it's not just hill forts. The evidence here is somewhat anecdotal. We're fortunate in Fife that we've got Simon Taylor's absolutely majestic 5-volume book on the place names of Fife, which really reveals the Pictish origins of a whole number of place names. And very interestingly, there's some very interesting candidates along the coast there for possible forts. So you've got Crail, Caer Ale, the fort on the rock in Pictish. You've got Kirkcaldy, Caer Caled, the fort, the hard fort, or the fort of the hard man, which I quite like as a translation that Simon gives. There's actually an area of Kirkcaldy called Dunnicaire. The area called Dunnicaire today isn't actually the same as the old Dunnicaire. The aristocracy moved it when they moved their land holdings at some point. But the fact that there's a place in Kirkcaldy called Dunnicaire, remember that's exactly the same as the promontory fort that Gordon Noble excavated up in Aberdeen. I think these are tantalising clues that actually, given what we know about the strength of the Pictish navy, and I'm thinking here of Burgh Head, and knowing that they probably had muster points along the coast, I think there are probably a whole lot of candidates in Fife that we ought to be looking for and looking closely at to see whether they fit that sort of that sort of profile. We did actually go looking for it at Wemyss. We looked at the promontory sticking out into the sea. Unfortunately, all we found was an enormous amount of sand and no evidence of a promontory fort, much to my own disappointment. So that doesn't mean there wasn't a fort there. I think, given all the evidence that we have about what else was happening there, it'd be surprising if there wasn't a power base and a fort there. But if it was there, it wasn't on the promontory. So I'm now going to quickly move on to look at the Christian Picts. The small crosses here are the thin crosses are the incised stones, so not cross slabs, but incised stones with early Christian crosses. And the thick black lines along the coast, including on the cave sites where we also get the class 1 symbols, are incised rocks, incised crosses in caves. So again, it's very largely a coastal distribution to these. I'm going to next bring in the cross slabs, and these are the cross slabs. The grey rectangles are the cross slabs that contain some Pictish symbols. So again, they're all, the distribution of these is along the coast. And then I'll bring in the cross slabs, the later Pictish cross slabs. These are which devoid of symbols, and you can see there's a lot more of these. But again, the distribution here is right around the edge of Fife. There's just this outlier here that's actually inland, and these ones in the east of Fife here, a largely coastal distribution to them. And finally, these large black crosses are the freestanding crosses, so not cross slabs, and again right on the edge of Fife. So in summary, really, I think what this distribution shows is most of the early Pictish activity is centered here around the Eden Valley and also along the coast here, and most of the later Pictish activity is really coastal. So how do we account for that seeming distribution pattern? And again, I mean, something else I should mention here is notable. The west of Fife is almost completely devoid of Pictish symbols. So that if we're talking about Pictish Fife, I think we're really only talking about east and central Fife. There's absolutely nothing out here that you can regard really as Pictish at all. And that's also, it's revealing this map, and I hadn't realized until I made it, just how on the edge Wemyss is here. We've tended to think of it as the southern border, the southern edge of Pictland on the south coast of the Forth. It's actually marking the western boundary of Pictland as well in that early Pictish period. So how do we account for this seeming distribution pattern? Okay. This is a much seen map, and it's very crude, and there's much more subtlety involved in what's going on here. But really, if you look at Fife, this area here, you can see that it's surrounded by other groups of people. And of course, later the Vikings come sailing down the Forth as well. Before the Angles in Northumbria, you've got the Votadini, the Gododin, a non-Pictish people. So really, Fife, if you like, is border territory, is borderlands, and the angles don't just stay south of the Forth. We know that for at least some of the period, from the fall of Edinburgh around 638 to the Battle of Nectansmere in 685, Fife was either under direct control or as a client kingdom of the Northumbrians. So you had a Northumbrian intrusion into Fife for a long period. And it's only really after that period that you get the abundance of Pictish Christian art in the form of the cross slabs and so on. So I'd really like to suggest that I think possibly what we're seeing in Fife is that you get an early development of Pictish cultural markers, the class 1 stones, but that it's uneven throughout Fife, and that it's actually quite fragile and vulnerable, and perhaps even dies out in places like Wemyss, which are extremely vulnerable to not just direct military intervention, but it's a cultural crossroads as well. There's lots of ideas and cultural exchange coming in. So I think really, in summary, that I tend to agree with what people like Alex Wolff have written elsewhere, that when we use the term Pictishness as a catch-all, it's a useful shorthand, but when we look more closely at the detail, perhaps it's hiding more than it actually reveals, and that we need to start looking much more closely about local patterns of Pictishness and distribution maps and things to really see how that played out in localities, and that perhaps Fife was vulnerable, Pictish Fife was vulnerable and died out in some places before seeing a more coherent and uniform renaissance under the Viturian dominance from the 8th century. Okay, so that's my speculations. Finally, I want to return to Wemyss. I've talked about the past, and I just now want to say a few words about the future. As many of you know, and as you've seen, the site is very precious, but it's also extremely vulnerable, not just to the weather and the sea, but to ongoing antisocial behaviour. We get graffiti, we get fires, we get other damage to the carvings. So for those of you that haven't seen the publicity around this, and we try to make as much publicity as possible, I'll just mention here that we've now taken a really important step forward in the future protection of the site. We've put in 2 funding applications for a total of £100,000, which is what it's going to cost us to put protective gates in to protect what we have left. And our plan is these will only be closed at night. We want to make sure that the caves remain open to anybody that wants to go and see them and has a good reason to see them, and hopefully also use it as regeneration for the local economy, so that we actually have people who open and close the gates at night. And it's very much a community-led thing. So these are artists' impressions of what those gates would look like. It's very much our intention that they don't detract from what's there, that they actually add to the site. So we're incorporating Pictish designs into the gates themselves. In fact, this is probably more the design we're going to go for. We're actually going to twist the bars around and have a slightly different lighting effect to incorporate the gates. This is all open for discussion. And the link at the bottom there is for the consultation that we're taking place with at the moment. So really the reason for showing you this, one of the reasons, is to urge you all to take part in that consultation, because it's not just the local community that we want involved. Local community support is extremely important, but the more feedback we can get, the more people saying yes, it's a good idea. And also, if you don't agree it's a good idea, coming up with ideas about what else we can do to make sure that it's still there for future generations, then that's important to us as well. And we can certainly change the plans at this stage. So please go to that link and take part in that consultation. But the other reason for bringing it to your attention is we might not get that £100,000. And even if we do, we might need more. So watch out for any virtual begging bowls that we might be handing out over the summer to help us do this. Okay, that's me. I've covered an enormous amount. Hopefully you took some of it in. I'm sure there's lots of comments and disagreements, particularly with the latter part of what I said. This is where you can download the archaeological report from, scapetrust.org/reports. And this is where you can go to learn more about the caves and about ourselves at SWACS, and of course buy our famous hand-knitted Pictish hats, which help us pay for the work that we do at the caves. So I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was fantastic. If you would like to unshare your screen, and we'll bring the crowd back up onto view, and hopefully you'll agree to do some question and answer. If you've got your face up on screen, you can wave a hand and I'll invite you to unmute and ask a question. If you would prefer to do it in writing, you can message me and I will read your question out for you. So let's see, have we got any hands waving to start with a question? We do. John Urquhart, unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Right, you can hear me now. It's not so much a question. I was just going to.
I think you're very, very quiet, John. Can you speak up a bit louder?
That better?
Not much.
Sorry about that. How about that?
That's a little bit better.
I just wanted to say that Mike could add to his collection of Fife Pictish elements the monastery on the Isle of May. Quite an important addition, I think.
Did you get that, Mike?
I did. And the thing about the Isle of May is that there is no evidence. There's evidence that it fits into the period, but there's no evidence of Pictish cultural activity there, which in itself is interesting, I think. There are lots of sites in Fife that, and perhaps in addition to the map would be to show all the other early medieval sites in Fife that don't have any direct evidence of Pictish activity that we can identify archaeologically, because I think that might actually show that the Pictish sites that we have are actually awash in a sea of places that aren't clearly identifiable as Pictish. And there are some archaeological remains. I'm thinking, for example, the Skeeth stone, which are clearly not Pictish, but also date to that period. So I think it's an interesting question. There are lots of things I could have included there, but they actually do lack those Pictish signifiers that meant we can clearly include them as part of Pictish, part of the Pictish remains. That's not to say they're not Pictish, but I only went for the things that definitely can be said to be.
I think actually, Mike, that the point you made towards the end there about Fife being at this a crossroads, a cultural crossroads. I mean, stones like the Skeeth one and the evidence that we have from Isle of May shows that I think we do have incoming people establishing Christian things that seem to be apparently separate from and devoid of Pictish influence. They're creating their own little corner over on the fringe of Pictland, but kind of doing it in their own way and under influence from elsewhere. Any other questions? Wave a hand if you would like to ask something. No hands waving. No chat. Oh, yeah. Okay, Graham, go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Mike, you packed in an enormous amount of detail in an hour. Fantastic. But my question is just very general. Do you think it's fair to call some of the carvings doodles, or is that endangering undervaluing their significance?
I think it's extremely unfair. I think part of the problem that the Wemyss Caves have suffered with is the antiquarians didn't regard them as doodles. All the early accounts of the people who looked at them saw them securely within the tradition of Pictish carvings. The form that we see them in now, they are very, very badly degraded, and when they were because of the location, but also the human activity subsequently. And if we bear in mind that they would have been much more finely executed, they would have been much clearer. I think they would have been much higher quality, but there's no doubting that they're simpler in form. And I think that's a combination of the damage to them and the fact that they're simpler in form is where this idea comes from, that this is just people messing around who don't really understand Pictish art. I think our view, and there's other members of SWAX here who can disagree with me, but I think our collective view really is that what this represents is possibly some of the earliest carvings before it becomes a much more formalized form, and that you do things in a particular way. You have fish at a particular angle. you have your Z rods at a particular angle. You have you start embellishing them with interlacing and internal spirals and things. So I think what we're looking at Wemyss isn't so much people just messing around not knowing what they're doing, but really, if you like, that some of the very earliest attempts before it becomes a much more recognized and formalized form, that things are done in a particular way. That's really, I think, how we view it.
Very good, thank you. Now I think I've got one question coming in here from Hugh. Mike, you mentioned the dating and design parallels between Wemyss and Dunkerque. Do you see further parallels between those and the designs and possible dating in portable artifacts? For example, designs based around triangles appear in all three.
Yes, I think I didn't talk about portable artifacts at all. Leslie Alcock mentions a portable artifact from Sanday in this set, and I think, yes, you can certainly make the case that there is certainly close similarities. We don't have a lot of these portable artifacts, obviously we don't have firm dating evidence for them, which is why I was careful which is why I didn't include them in the comparisons, because we do have radiocarbon dates from the other sites that we can really use for dating. But yes, I think there certainly are similarities, and that I would suggest that really my thesis that the cave carvings at places like Wemyss are some of the earliest. I would also apply that to some of the portable objects as well.
Okay, another one here from Helen. Have you looked at the little man with the knobbed spear? I think she probably means what were you calling it, the Thor one. Have you looked at him in relation to the depictions of Cosidius, the great northern warrior god?
That's a very interesting question. Not yet. I've got a huge amount of reading to do on this. I was actually reading a little bit about depictions of warriors in wider Iron Age society before I came on, and Cosidius is certainly something that I put down. So if anybody knows more and can expand more on that, then please feel free, because it's something I'd certainly be keen to know more about. One of the things about that carving, I mean, we call him Thor, but just to be clear, none of us think that he is Thor. That's a name given to him colloquially from a time when people were really excited about the Vikings and were giving everything Vikings name. It's also what the boat in Jonathan's Cave suffers from, being known as the Viking Boat. There's absolutely no reason to believe that's a Viking boat, and that it's anything other than a Pictish boat. But one of the things we think is that it does demonstrate the similarities with it to the carving in Northumbria suggests that actually there are influences going on there from beyond Fife, and you know, this is really part of the argument as well, that there are other cultural influences going on in Fife beyond classically Pictish influences that might have influenced the form of it. But yes, I can't pretend to know anything about Cosidius, but I intend to find out.
Okay, one more written one here, and then I'll see if there are any hands waving. The big book on Sculptor's Cave, Ian Armott's publication, do you know if that is available online as a PDF yet? I have a feeling it's probably too new to have been put online for free, but do you know if it has?
I honestly don't know. I've got the big glossy hardback.
Yeah. I think that would be the
which I tried to read as bedtime reading, but it's just unwieldy. So
it's too tiring.
It's very comprehensive.
Yeah.
But
I suppose just Google and see, Lily, and see whether anything comes up as a PDF version. Right, I've got one more written one here, but I'm just going to see if there are any hands waving, seeing as I've had the boxes. Anybody? Oh, yeah, right, I see Kelly waving and then Kevin. So Kelly, you go first.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Mike. That was an excellent talk. I just wanted to mention that I agree with you about the human figures in Jonathan's Cave, that they probably are Pictish, just because the style is so similar to those other simple, incised human figures in early Pictish art. But as well, the way in which they do the feet. So the feet of the figure on the left, I believe, was almost identical to the carvings that you get from from Riney, even the one from Riney Barflat, where there's a bit more detail. But one of the things I thought that was really interesting about those is it appears to be two figures who are sort of facing one another. And usually on sort of the where these are just sort of carved on stones, it's just one sort of man or one warrior. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Sorry, you mean about the figure on the right hand side?
Yeah, did I see that correctly? Are there two sort of, yeah, there's two.
Yeah, well, the antiquarians could certainly see two people because they refer to them as the Adam and Eve figure. And Christian McLagan also thought she could see a baby between them, which nobody else could. The figure on the right is extremely difficult to see as a human figure, to my mind. We've been concentrating on the one on the left because that's the one that really leaps out as being sort of that same sort of form. But when we can get back into the caves again and do some proper work, I'm going to switch my attention to that right hand one. And also, while I was doing research on this, there's quite possibly another Pictish beast that we've never noticed amongst them as well. So there's certainly a lot more work to be done. This was really the first stage of having a much closer look at what's there. And there's other carvings in there as well that we really don't know much about that could repay further examination. But yes, some of the antiquarians clearly said that it was two figures. Okay. It's very, very hard to justify that now.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. And it's are those images available on Sketchfab?
Yeah, I've put the full frieze on Sketchfab, so you'll see both figures. The one on the right, we've always thought it's an animal.
An animal, okay.
A swan or something, because it's got that sort of head. But it may well be feet of a now disappeared person. It doesn't really look likely, but again, the more people that can look at it and give their opinion, the better. So please, if I put that Sketchfab link in now, actually in the chat.
Yeah, actually, that would be.
And go and have a look at that themselves.
Okay, Kevin Riley, go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fascinating talk this evening. Thanks very much, Mike. Fascinating for more than one reason. I've been working on a project for the last 3 years, which mirrors yours almost exactly. And it's not so much with regards to the Pictish artwork. It's more about the data presentation. So what I've done is I've downloaded every single data point from Canmore, and I've combined it with all of the place name data into a pin on a Google Earth map. Okay, so it's literally just lines and dots on the map, simply for one reason. You remember that slide you brought up of the Roman Gask Ridge image? The problem with that image is it only shows Roman fortifications. But these are military fortifications. They don't make any sense unless you can actually see where the indigenous people have their forts. And it's this idea, exactly what you're doing, is to actually view the data against each other. So, for example, I've got one folder inside. It's a Google Earth KMZ file, and I've got one folder for Fife, which has all of the Pictish stones inside. But I haven't actually sorted them out into class 1, class 2, and class 3, etc. So I've actually sent you a private message with my email address on it, and I would very much like if you would get in touch with me. And what I will do is I'll send you a copy of my work. I think you'll find it very useful because I think we're working on a very similar thing here, Mike.
Yeah, I actually replied to you in the chat, thanking you for that, and I definitely will be in touch because I think the more sources of data that we can look at, the better the picture of what we've got is going to be. I haven't mapped the place names of Fife yet, but those that I did map, I didn't have enough of them to really draw any conclusions. For those that I did map, also the ones that are still in use that are clearly of Pictish origin, Cooper, Burn Turk, Strathmiglo, seem to cluster again around the Eden Valley. There does seem to be a correlation again there of distribution, which again, not going to draw any firm conclusions, but it does tend to suggest that actually the fact that those place names persist show that was actually a focused area for Pictish activity, and that they kept their place names long after other places had lost theirs.
Sorry, can I ask you another quick question, Mike? Has anybody ever done a map of the Pictish stones as they were in their original locations?
My map shows the find spots, not where they are now. Yeah.
Because I find that there's a Pictish stone in Abday Graveyard, which is nearby me. It's up near Cairpoo. But it's now inside the graveyard. But I know well, it was written in the local historical records that it was originally in Lindores. And they even described it was only moved in 1975.
There's a number of stones. The position of them that I put on the map, I took great care to actually put the find spots.
I really do hope you email me, Mike, but thank you very much for your time.
And not where 19th century landowners decided they'd look better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for your time, mate.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Mike, can I ask you, when in your distribution map, you put up a dot, I think you were still talking about Pictish symbols, and you put up a dot at Fife Ness, I'm presuming it may be Constantine's Cave. Do you have a record of a Pictish symbol in there?
Let me try and bring up the map. If somebody else wants to ask another question while I'm consulting my notes.
Okay, are there any other waving hands? Anybody? No, nobody. There's one thing I can read out. Ian McAleer has said there is a weapon in Old Gaelic tales called the Gath Bolg. Gath means a spear, but the bolg refers to a bag shape. Could it be similar? I presume he's meaning to this Thor's nobly ended spear. He says, I must check the etymology of the word. Let us know when you've checked. And one from Hugh in answer to Kevin. I have the grid refs and latitude longitudes of all Pictish artifacts with the aim of having the first known location of them. However, they are not all known, and that's very true indeed. No more waving hands from anybody. Have you found your map yet? If not, you can get back to me.
I'll get back to you personally.
Yeah.
I think there was an arch symbol. If it's Constantine's Cave, I think I'm right in saying there was an arch symbol.
Right. I would like to know that about that, because I certainly didn't find anything, and I spent long enough in that cave where I almost had my postal ballot getting sent there. So let me know about that.
Yeah, just on the bolg, there's a place in Fife, Blebo, and Simon Taylor's derivation of that from the original forms is it's Blado Bolgum, which means meal sack hill. So that fits with the bolg of the sack, because it's meant to be sack shaped. And just one interesting thing about that is it's known as Meal Sack Hill, and on Ptolemy's map of Fife, slap bang in the middle of Fife, right on top of Blebo, he marks a thing called Horere, which is Latin for granary. So make of that what you will. It could be completely accidental, but the fact that you've got a place, an early medieval place name meaning Meal Sack Hill, and Ptolemy sticks the Roman for granary on top of it. That's an intriguing thing that I haven't researched yet. It may be a complete red herring, but I found that quite interesting.
Very good. Well, I don't see any more. Somebody has another question has just popped in here from Mary. Are there any class 2 or class 3 stones in Fife? If not, what happened? Well, yes, I think you showed those on your distribution map.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and they're the ones that are clustered. I mean, there's any number of class 3s in around St Andrews.
Yes.
Dozens and dozens in the museum, and a few elsewhere. Not many class 2s at all. So again, the idea that there's a reintroduction, if you like, of Pictish carving after a possible lull tends to, I think, be supported by that. There are very, very few class 2, and those that are appear to be quite late.
There we go. Well, I think in the absence of any other waving hands, we will finish off there, and thank you very much for a fascinating, excellent talk.
John, can I just quickly say Constantine's Cave? I've discovered why I included it is because there are 2 carvings there of animal forms, which are very, very similar to some of the animals that we have in Wemyss,
Yes.
that are alongside the other Pictish carvings. So that's why I included them as possible, not symbols, but possible early Pictish.
Right. Okay. I think general consensus of the people I've consulted would put them into the Iron Age,
Right.
but you pays your money and you takes your choice. Thanks for clearing that up. Well, thank you for an excellent and very in-depth talk there, Mike. Hope you can all join us next month on Friday the 19th of March, when our speaker is Dr. Oisin Plum from the University of the Highlands and Islands, based up in Orkney, and he'll be looking at the Picts in the Irish Church. So going from here over there, which would be rather nice. So thanks again, Mike. Thanks to everyone for joining us from all over the world, and stay safe, and we'll hopefully see you all next month. Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.